The snow had been falling for days, thick and heavy, burying the quiet streets of Maplewood Estates. Neighbors huddled inside, but one homeowner watched in disbelief as the HOA dismissed every warning, every plea, every sign of danger. Emails went unanswered, phone calls ignored. Then just before dawn the unimaginable happened. A wall of snow tore through the neighborhood, smashing cars, crushing fences and threatening homes. All the petty rules, the fines, the endless demands suddenly seemed meaningless in the face of nature's fury. How did a community so meticulously controlled spiral into chaos overnight? And who, if anyone, would be held accountable for ignoring the warning signs? Sarah and her husband Mark had moved to Maplewood Estates 3 years ago, drawn by the quiet streets lined with maple trees and the promise of a friendly, orderly neighborhood. Their home, a modest 2-story with a sunlit kitchen and a small backyard garden, had quickly become their sanctuary. Weekends were spent tending roses, baking bread, or hosting small dinners with neighbors who waved from across manicured lawns. Life was predictable, peaceful, almost perfect. Yet, beneath the charm, the community was tightly controlled by the Homeowners Association. Rules about fence heights, lawn colors and mailbox design seemed harmless at first, until Sarah noticed the HOA's subtle scrutiny. A neighbor's complaint about a slightly crooked garden gnome here, an obscure fine for leaving recycling bins out there. These hints of control were easy to ignore. But as the first signs of the approaching winter arrived, Sarah felt a nagging unease. Something in the HOA's rigid oversight suggested that even the smallest misstep could spiral into conflict, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the peace she cherished might be fragile. Snow warnings came early that year, but Maplewood's HOA dismissed them with an almost bureaucratic coldness. Emails went unanswered, notices ignored, and the usual neighborhood chatter seemed unusually muted. Sarah kept checking forecasts and radar maps, feeling a tension that she couldn't articulate. She wasn't just worried about the storm. Something about the way the HOA operated, its obsession with rules, its disregard for resident safety, hinted that this winter would be different. The community she loved was about to face a reckoning, and she had no idea how personal the consequences would become. Winter had settled over Maplewood Estates, blanketing the streets in a thick, pristine layer of snow that made the neighborhood appear peaceful and untouched. But for Sarah and Mark, each snowfall was a reminder of the looming tension they could no longer ignore. The HOA's obsession with control, which had seemed petty and distant during the warmer months, became suffocatingly real as winter approached. It began subtly. One morning, Sarah received a terse letter slipped under her door, stamped with the HOA logo. The notice cited her non-compliant mailbox, claiming it didn't match the approved color palette. Sarah stared at her mailbox, a soft gray that had passed inspection for years. Confused and frustrated, she called the HOA office, hoping for clarification. The receptionist's cold voice offered only a mechanical, "The board has voted on the issue. It must be corrected immediately." No explanation, no compromise, just an unyielding demand. By the end of that week the fines started to appear. Small at first, $50, $75, but they multiplied rapidly, compounding with each minor infraction. A crooked garden gnome, a slightly uneven fence post, even a snow shovel left leaning against the garage was flagged. Each notice arrived in the mailbox like a timed bomb, igniting anxiety that Sarah and Mark could neither ignore nor fully justify. What began as minor inconveniences spiraled into a relentless barrage of rules enforced without reason, without empathy. But the real tension surfaced when neighbors began to intervene. Mrs. Thompson from 3 doors down, known for her hawk-like vigilance, started reporting every minor deviation. The HOA, which had previously dismissed smaller complaints, now acted with alarming efficiency. Sarah watched helplessly as the fines escalated, each notice accompanied by veiled threats. Failure to comply may result in legal action. The community she had once loved began to feel hostile, every neighbor's glance suspicious, every footstep outside a potential critique. Amid this mounting pressure, Sarah discovered that the HOA had also refused to address the increasingly urgent snow warnings. Forecasters predicted record snowfall, yet the HOA board remained silent, more concerned with enforcing decorative compliance than protecting homes. Sarah sent emails, made calls, and even offered to organize volunteers to clear common areas, but the HOA dismissed every attempt. The sense of helplessness gnawed at her, like watching a storm approach with no shelter in sight. As days passed, the tension in the neighborhood escalated further. Mark tried to intervene, attending the HOA board meetings in hopes of negotiating a compromise. Instead, he was met with dismissive glances, pointed remarks about his disrespect for community rules, and the subtle, suffocating power plays of a board determined to assert dominance. Arguments erupted over minor infractions, transforming the once friendly winter walks into minefields of confrontation. One night, after a particularly heated board meeting, Sarah returned home to find a notice taped to her door, a formal complaint alleging she had obstructed HOA property by leaving a firewood stack too close to the community sidewalk. The claim was absurd, but the fines that followed were not. Panic set in as Sarah realized they could not ignore these escalating threats. Every decision, every step, was scrutinized and resistance seemed impossible. Despite the mounting stress, Sarah refused to be passive. She began meticulously documenting every interaction, every fine, every email, building a record of the HOA's growing abuse of authority. The strain, however, was relentless. Snowstorms hit harder than predicted, streets became treacherous, and yet the HOA continued to ignore warnings and resident pleas. The tension between safety and bureaucratic obsession reached a breaking point, leaving Sarah in a constant state of fear, not just of the storm but of the relentless, arbitrary power that had taken hold of her community. Weeks blurred together as the HOA's demands grew more absurd. Fines doubled, board members patrolled the streets with clipboards, and neighbors whispered behind closed doors. Even simple acts of daily life, shoveling a driveway, adjusting a garden decoration, clearing snow from the mailbox, became fraught with risk. Sarah's frustration boiled into quiet rage, an emotional undercurrent that threatened to spill over. She was no longer just a resident, she had become a target of a system that prized control over humanity. Then came the first warning signs of the disaster to come. Heavy snow accumulated in ways the HOA had failed to anticipate, drifts forming against fences and rooftops. Sarah watched as neighbors scrambled to make sense of the icy buildup, only to find the HOA still issuing fines for minor infractions, ignoring the more immediate threat. Panic mingled with disbelief. Could bureaucracy be more dangerous than the storm itself? Sarah's sense of dread deepened. The neighborhood's obsession with appearances, with obedience, seemed almost sinister in the face of nature's indifference. The tipping point arrived one evening when Sarah noticed cracks forming along her garage roof. Snow piled unnaturally, pushing against the structure like a silent, patient enemy. She sent urgent emails to the HOA pleading for guidance, for support, for someone, anyone, to acknowledge the danger. The responses were cold, mechanical, and bureaucratic. Residents are responsible for their own property maintenance, the board wrote. Please ensure compliance with HOA snow management guidelines. Guidelines that had no practical solution for the sheer weight of snow threatening to crush her home. Panic transformed into desperation. Mark and Sarah worked tirelessly to reinforce their property, hauling sandbags, shoveling roofs, and enlisting a few neighbors who had quietly taken safety into their own hands. Yet everywhere they looked, the HOA continued its campaign of petty oversight. Snow-laden roofs, blocked sidewalks, uneven fences, all became excuses for fines and warnings. Each day brought a new absurdity, each notice a reminder that the community's obsession with control had grown more dangerous than the winter itself. And then the final warning came, not in the form of another notice, not as a complaint from a neighbor, but through nature itself. The sky darkened unusually fast, winds howled like the echo of some impending judgment, and the snow, already heavy, began to fall with relentless intensity. Sarah's heart pounded as she realized the storm was no longer a distant forecast. It was here, and the HOA's negligence had left the community vulnerable. The streets they had walked so peacefully weeks ago now looked treacherous, unstable, and ominous. As night fell, the rising tension became unbearable. Sarah and Mark, exhausted from fighting both bureaucracy and weather, watched helplessly as the snow piles shifted and groaned. Every creak of the roof, every snap of an ice-laden tree branch, was a reminder of how dangerously unprepared their neighborhood had become. What had begun as petty rule enforcement and neighborly surveillance had escalated into a life-or-death scenario. And at the center of it all was the HOA, blind to the real danger, more invested in appearances than in human safety. Then, just as Sarah began to believe that the worst might still be avoided, the storm revealed its full force. Snow avalanches began to cascade from the higher streets, cutting through the neighborhood like unstoppable white rivers. Panic erupted as residents scrambled to protect cars, pets, and their homes. Sarah's meticulous preparations provided some measure of safety, but it was clear that Maplewood Estates was unprepared for the scale of disaster, precisely because the HOA had ignored every warning, every plea, every subtle signal of danger. And in that chaos, a terrifying thought struck Sarah. All the petty fines, the obsessive rules, the daily harassment, they were nothing compared to what might happen if the storm was allowed to take its course. The conflict she had endured, the endless frustration and humiliation, had brought her to this moment. The neighborhood she had loved so dearly teetered on the brink, and there was no one to turn to accept themselves. The rising action had reached its apex, and the storm, and the reckoning, was just beginning. The night the storm struck, Maplewood Estates was unrecognizable. Streets once quiet and pristine were buried under mountains of snow, roofs sagging under the relentless weight, and cars trapped like frozen relics in white tombs. The air was thick with tension, cold and suffocating, as if the neighborhood itself held its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Sarah and Mark moved frantically, shovels in hand, sandbags at the ready, trying to protect what they could. Every step brought a new horror, branches snapping under heavy snow, fences buckling, ice forming dangerous drifts along rooftops. And then it happened. A massive avalanche tore down from the upper hill, smashing into the homes below with a force that left no doubt. Nature would not be negotiated with, no matter how many HOA rules existed. Sarah watched in horror as neighbors scrambled, some screaming, others frozen with disbelief. The chaos was absolute. Cars were buried instantly, yards obliterated, and the snow plowed through the streets like a living entity. In that terrifying instant, the petty rules, the fines, the obsessive control of the HOA felt meaningless, a cruel mockery of power in the face of overwhelming natural force. But the most shocking moment was yet to come. As the snow subsided slightly, Sarah turned toward the HOA office, the symbol of the bureaucracy that had ignored warnings, dismissed emails, and punished residents for trivialities. The building itself had been partially crushed under snow, doors jammed, files scattered in the ice. There, for the first time, the board members, once untouchable in their rigid authority, looked helpless, small, and entirely human. Their power had vanished in an instant, stripped away not by rebellion, but by the storm they had failed to respect. Fueled by a mix of fear and pent-up anger, Sarah realized the moment had come to confront them. She began documenting the devastation, taking photographs, recording videos, cataloging the damage that had resulted directly from their negligence. It wasn't just about fines anymore, it was about accountability. One by one, neighbors joined her, voices rising in unison, recounting ignored warnings, unheeded emails, and the endless petty harassment they had endured. The HOA, once feared, was now exposed before the very community they had sought to control. Legal threats flew immediately after. The HOA attempted to shift blame, citing resident responsibility, but Sarah had prepared meticulously, her documentation airtight. Emails, notices, fines, all recorded, all linked to the board's negligence. Lawyers arrived, insurance agents assessed damage, and slowly the scales began to tip. The board members could no longer hide behind rules. The storm had revealed the absurdity and cruelty of their obsession with control, leaving only raw accountability in its wake. Yet even as relief surged through Sarah and Mark, a pang of disbelief lingered. This was more than vindication. It was a harsh lesson in the fragility of authority and the consequences of ignoring human needs. Homes were damaged, memories shattered, and the neighborhood would never be the same. But in that moment, with snow still falling softly around them, the tide had turned. The powerless had gained clarity, and the oppressors were exposed, humbled, and finally visible in their human vulnerability. As Sarah looked over the wreckage, she felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and triumph. Every email ignored, every petty fine imposed, had led to this moment, a reckoning that the HOA could neither deny nor escape. The storm had stripped the veneer of control away, leaving nothing but raw truth. Authority untempered by responsibility was fragile, and sometimes, nature itself would deliver justice in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. And in the silence that followed, amid the cracked roofs and buried cars, a single thought struck her with the clarity of a bell toll. Power means nothing if it blinds you to reality, and sometimes reality comes crashing down, unstoppable and undeniable. In the aftermath of the storm, Maplewood Estates was a landscape of devastation. Snow had finally stopped falling, leaving streets lined with twisted fences, shattered mailboxes, and cars buried under layers of icy rubble. But amid the wreckage, a different kind of clarity began to emerge. Residents who had once quarreled over petty rules now worked together, uniting in a shared determination to rebuild. The petty grievances that had defined the HOA's power seemed almost laughable in comparison to the scale of the damage, but the lessons they carried were profound and lasting. Sarah and Mark spent days surveying the destruction, noting which areas were most vulnerable, and helping neighbors dig out cars and clear rooftops. The chaos of the storm had revealed cracks not only in the physical structures of the neighborhood but also in the community's social fabric. The HOA, once untouchable in its ability to fine, intimidate, and control, was now in shambles, both figuratively and literally. Board members had retreated, their offices damaged and their authority irreparably weakened. Residents no longer feared petty fines or arbitrary complaints. They feared nothing more than nature itself, which had already demonstrated its formidable power. With the HOA's incompetence laid bare, Sarah found herself at the center of a new movement within the community. Her meticulous records, emails, notices, photographs, videos, became evidence not only for insurance claims but for a broader reckoning. Lawyers and insurance adjusters arrived to document losses and assess liability, confirming what Sarah had long suspected. The HOA had failed in its most basic duties, ignoring repeated warnings about snow accumulation, safety hazards, and emergency preparedness. This documentation became a pivotal point in the legal fallout that would follow. For the first time, the neighborhood began to operate without fear of arbitrary oversight. Residents held meetings to decide collectively how to address repairs, share resources, and plan for the future. Petty rules about mailbox colors or garden ornaments became irrelevant. They were replaced by practical discussions about structural safety, emergency snow removal, and the emotional well-being of the community. Sarah, who had once feared confrontation, found herself a trusted voice in these meetings. Her tireless efforts to hold the HOA accountable had transformed her from a targeted resident into a community leader. The legal consequences for the HOA were severe. The storm's aftermath exposed not just negligence but a pattern of abusive power that bordered on harassment. Homeowners filed claims citing both the physical damage and the mental strain imposed by the board's relentless fines and warnings. While the courts could not undo the damage wrought by the avalanche, they recognized the extraordinary failure of the HOA to fulfill its duties. Some board members faced removal or were barred from serving in similar positions, and the community voted to replace the old HOA structure with a new system, one emphasizing transparency, communication, and accountability. Insurance claims became a lifeline for many residents. Coverage that had seemed frustratingly bureaucratic before the storm was now critical, allowing families to repair their homes and replace lost possessions. Sarah's thorough documentation accelerated the claims process, and neighbors who had once resented her diligence began to see its value. Together they rebuilt not only houses but trust and a sense of mutual respect. The experience had forged a bond that was stronger than any rule the old HOA could have enforced. Even beyond legal and financial recovery, the storm brought emotional clarity. Sarah reflected on the months of harassment, the petty fines, and the constant anxiety imposed by the board. It had been exhausting, demoralizing, and sometimes frightening, but it had also revealed the power of persistence, preparation, and community solidarity. The avalanche, destructive as it had been, became a catalyst for growth. Residents learned to look past trivial disputes, to prioritize human safety and dignity, and to recognize that rules without empathy could be more dangerous than chaos itself. The rebuilding process also sparked discussions about long-term preparedness. Residents pooled resources to hire snow-clearing services, establish emergency response plans, and install structural reinforcements for roofs and gutters. Neighborhood watch programs shifted from surveilling minor cosmetic violations to ensuring safety and mutual assistance. In essence, Maplewood Estates had transformed from a community obsessed with appearances into one focused on resilience, collaboration, and genuine care. Sarah and Mark, once isolated by the arbitrary power of the HOA, now felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Their home, though battered, had survived. Their neighbors, though shaken, had endured. The sense of helplessness that had once gripped them during the storm was replaced with empowerment. They had turned frustration into action, fear into leadership, and intimidation into accountability. For Sarah especially, the experience was transformative. A lesson in courage, resilience, and the importance of standing up against injustice, no matter how entrenched the opposition. Interestingly, the old HOA board attempted to push back, issuing statements defending their decisions and attempting to shift blame. But their voices were drowned out by the collective outrage and evidence compiled by residents. Public opinion, both within the neighborhood and in wider media coverage, overwhelmingly sided with the homeowners. What had begun as a story of individual struggle evolved into a cautionary tale about unchecked authority and the consequences of ignoring practical realities for the sake of control. Over the following months, Maplewood Estates slowly regained its sense of normalcy. Streets were cleared, homes repaired, and community gatherings resumed. Yet, the memory of the storm and the absurd, dangerous obsession of the HOA lingered. Residents were wiser, more vigilant, and more united. They had witnessed firsthand how quickly small conflicts could escalate into life-threatening situations when bureaucracy ignored reality. And they had learned that standing together, documenting every interaction and prioritizing human welfare above arbitrary rules could turn even the direst circumstances into an opportunity for justice and growth. For Sarah, the journey had been profoundly personal. She had endured harassment, fines, and stress that no homeowner should face. Yet she had emerged stronger, wiser, and more capable of protecting not only her own home but the well-being of an entire community. The storm, devastating as it had been, became a crucible in which fear was transformed into courage and inaction was replaced by decisive, impactful effort. The victory was not just in surviving the avalanche, it was in reclaiming agency, accountability, and the integrity of the neighborhood. Looking back, the most striking lesson was clear. Authority untempered by responsibility is not only absurd, it can be dangerous. Maplewood Estates had survived, but only because residents refused to be passive, refused to bow to petty rules, and refused to allow negligence to dictate their lives. Sarah's story, and the story of the entire community, became a testament to vigilance, courage, and the power of collective action in the face of both natural and bureaucratic disasters. And as the neighborhood began to thrive once more, a single question hung in the air, lingering in the minds of everyone who had lived through the ordeal. If bureaucracy can ignore the warning signs of a storm, what else might it overlook until it's too late? And who will be brave enough to stand up before disaster strikes?